Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Woodland Hills Interaction Series event with author Anjali Sachdeva. Special thanks to Ms. Clair's creative writing students and their projects, which you see along the walls behind you. The students each created a project surrounding one of Ms. Sachdeva's stories, so please take a moment to talk with the students about their hard work at the conclusion of today's interaction. Now in its 6th year, the Woodland Hills Interaction Series provides interactive experiences with influential thinkers to our students. Today's guest is no exception. Ms. Sachdeva is a writer and a teacher. Her short story collection, All the Names They Use for God, has been called strange and wonderful by a reviewer for the New York Times. Her stories bend genres and open her readers to worlds both known and unknown. Ms. Sachdeva currently teaches writing at the University of Pittsburgh. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Hey guys, thank you for coming out today, and thank you for all these beautiful projects. I was really looking at them before you all got here, and I just love them. I love that you all wrote your own parts of the stories, and I was just really enjoying looking at them, so thank you. I'm going to read just a little bit from one of these stories. I know a lot of you have read them already, so I'm just going to read a short section, and then I heard you have some questions for me, so I'm happy to answer questions, talk about what it's like to work as a writer or anything like that that you're curious about. And the section I'm going to read is from the title story, All the Names for God, and I'm just going to read a part near the beginning of the story. Abike stands in the doorway of my room and says, "I want to see my parents. Will you come with me?" I don't answer at first. I meet her gaze in the mirror, but keep wrapping my skirt. Abike's parents have moved to Abuja, and my family is also in Abuja now. She knows this. Though I have called them and written letters, I haven't seen my family since Abike and I were captured 8 years ago, when we were just 16. She knows this also. It is not a small favor to ask. I finish dressing. "All right," I say. Abike and I weren't close before we were kidnapped, but we come from the same village. She was the kind of girl who could be your best friend one minute and ridicule you without mercy the next. She thought she was special because she had cousins in Chicago who sent her tattered American magazines with articles about sex, and because during our lunch break at school she would always put on more makeup than anyone's mother would allow and roll up her uniform skirt until her thighs showed. So, of course, all the boys looked at her like she was a goddess when we sat outside, and somehow the teachers never caught her at it. Away from school, she was always prim and proper. If she passed my family in the street, she would say in her prissy English, "Hello, Mrs. Layani, Mr. Layani, I hope you are well." And when she had gone, my mother would say, "See, what a fine girl she is, so polite." We were at church when the soldiers came, a group of us helping the Sunday school teacher get ready for her class. Abike was setting the Bibles on the desks. My phone chimed and I saw it was a text from my mother, who knew I was in Sunday school, who knew I was not even supposed to be looking at my phone. The message said, "Come home, now, now." As I was staring at it, the phone began to ring and then the door crashed open. At first, we thought the men were government soldiers, that it was some kind of emergency and we were going to be evacuated. Then one of them walked up to Mrs. Adeyemi and shot her in the face. We all screamed and tried to run, but there was another man blocking the door. The soldier who had shot our teacher looked at her body on the floor and kicked it. "That's what you get for poisoning these girls' minds," he said. I thought, why is he talking to her when she's already dead? I had thoughts like that the whole day, very rational thoughts, like my brain was trying to throw weight on the other side of a scale against all the madness that was happening around me. The men told us to go outside. We found trucks waiting, filled with girls our age and with more soldiers. The men took our phones and any money we had. They pointed with their guns and said, "Get in." We rode for hours while the daylight faded into dusk onto smaller and smaller roads until we were moving through the forest. You could hear night birds and monkeys all around calling to each other. My friend Naomi was next to me and she said, "We should jump out now, promise. They might not even notice." We could hide in the leaves and they would never find us in the dark. I nodded, but neither of us jumped. I had never been anywhere this remote, and the wildness of the place terrified me. If I had known what the next few years would be like, I would have jumped even if I could see a lion waiting in the shadows. But back then, I was still hoping we would get to go home. Abike was in the same truck with us, crying and sniffling until finally one of the men said, "Shut up back there," and she was quiet. Later, she told me she thought we would all be killed, that they would douse us in gasoline and set us on fire. I don't know where she got that idea. We had never heard of any such thing happening to anyone. But in a way, she was not wrong. Parts of us would be burned away forever. And I'll just stop there with that one. So, just to give you guys a little background on me, I'm from Pittsburgh. So I've spent most of my life here, although I went away for college. I lived abroad for a while. I went away for graduate school, and during all that time, I was always doing writing, but I wasn't always doing this kind of writing. I wrote for the Post-Gazette for a while. I wrote for other newspapers. I wrote for businesses and for schools, and taught pretty much every kind of English class you can imagine. But then eventually I did start writing creative writing, and I went back to school for that and ended up writing stories. So I'm just curious what questions you guys have, whether it's about, if you've read the stories, if you have questions about specific things in the book, that's great, or if you have questions about how to make a living as a writer, or how I go about writing, anything like that, I'd be glad to answer them for you.
So I have a microphone which I'll come to you and give so you can have your question recorded for the camera here. So just raise your hand, I'll come to you with the mic and you can ask your question. Okay, the first one was back here.
Yeah. For the story, Killer of Kings, I wanted to know why does the angel visit John?
So that story is based on a real person, the poet John Milton, and he wrote this famous poem called Paradise Lost, and he claimed that the poem was actually told to him by an angel. He was blind and he couldn't write himself anymore, although he had been a writer for pretty much his whole life. But by the time he wrote this famous poem, he was pretty much completely blind, and when people asked him how he came up with it, he said that an angel told it to him. And so that part of it I just took from his real life and his description of it. But I did also, I think when I reimagined it, I thought about that the two of them were both sort of interested in pushing back against people in power, and so that she especially liked him for that reason.
For anything you might want, how long was it till Gina discovered the truth?
Till she discovered the truth about that he was still there and living with his ex. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember now. I think it's about a year. That story I wrote based on actually a fairy tale, a Polish fairy tale, and it's kind of like your traditional fairy tale where there's a young woman, she falls in love with a prince. But then there's a part in the fairy tale where he meets this other princess with a little child, and she says to him, if you pick that, in the original fairy tale, she says, if you pick that child up, you will forget me and you will never love me again. And I was like, that is wild. How did that end up in a fairy tale that's like hundreds of years old? And so when I started to write it, I was trying to think about, well, what would that story look like if it happened today and if it was in real life? So that's kind of how that story took shape. And so then when it's the end, and in the end of the original fairy tale, she, he goes away with this other princess, but she manages to find him and win him back, and they get married. But I thought in real life, like if that happens, then what happens to that other woman, right? Like there's no perfect happy ending in real life where everybody gets what they want. So I did want it to be that she was down there for a while, kind of doing her own thing before she runs into him again. But then I really had to think about, well, what would happen in reality when these three people come back together?
What made you want to write this book?
I wrote this book over a really long time. I mean, I want to say 12 or 13 years. And I was writing other things at that time too, but just writing the individual stories, they span that much time. So I didn't set out with any one particular goal when I wrote it, but I just have always loved to read. I've always been a big reader. And then probably when I was in college was when I really started writing seriously. I mean, when I was your age, or even when I was in middle school, I definitely took creative writing classes and I enjoyed it, but I never thought of it as something that I was do as a career. As I said, I worked as a journalist for a while, and at some point I realized that really what I liked about journalism was I liked to talk to people and I liked to tell people's stories, but I was less interested in the kind of research side of journalism, which is really important if you're a journalist, to be able to research a lot of information and dig up information for your own stories, and that was not really what appealed to me. And that was when I kind of made the shift to doing this type of writing. And I've loved it because it just allows me to step into that role of all the people who created all those books that I loved so much when I was a kid and still love to read. It's really fun to be on the other side of that.
So are all these stories connected?
So I didn't have an intentional connection to them when I wrote them, but then when I was ready to publish the book, I went and looked at all the stories that I had chosen and tried to think about, is there a connection between them? And the answer I came up with was that all the stories had to do with people putting their faith in or struggling with some bigger force than themselves. So the title is all the names they used for God. So sometimes it's religion, but sometimes it's people are putting their faith in science or in nature or in art or some other bigger thing that they're worshiping the same way that some people worship God. So that's why I chose that particular title for it. And that's also, I think, what ties all the stories together, even though they're in so many different places and time periods and everything.
During your experience as a writer, what advice would you give to other people who are aspiring to be like you?
You know, I would say, and this is not, I think, just for writers, but it's for any type of creative work that people like to do. So if you're a painter, or if you are interested in being a musician, but also if you're interested in being a writer, part of it is that you have to constantly push yourself to try the things that you're not good at in your art. So I used to be really bad at writing dialogue, and none of my stories had any dialogue ever. And I just had to force myself to write stories that had dialogue in it. And those initial stories were also really bad. Because it was just a skill I wasn't good at, but I did get better at it as I went along. So that's one thing I would really encourage is, I think the thing that divides people from someone who, like, this is just a hobby and I'm just doing it for fun, which is also, I think, a valuable thing to do, right? If you just enjoy writing for yourself, absolutely, I think that's worth doing. But if you want to be a professional, I think you have to push past just, this is what I enjoy, and actually push yourself to do the parts that you don't always enjoy, because that's how you're going to improve. And then beyond that, it's actually really hard to remember sometimes that creativity is important, because it's not something that's always rewarded in the real world. Like, you're not going to make as much money as a writer as you're going to make as a lawyer or an engineer or something like that. But I do think it brings a lot of joy into the world, and also a lot of, it actually forces people to kind of think about why they believe the things they believe. And so even though you don't have someone saying that to you every day and telling you that's why creativity is important, just to keep that in the back of your head that it is important.
For like the Pleiades or Pleiades,
Yeah, Pleiades.
How did Dell die?
You know, through the whole story, she's just getting sicker and sicker. And the way I was imagining it was, you know, like, she says at one point that she can feel enough for 7 people. Like, as each one of her sisters dies, everything that she's feeling is kind of multiplying, because she's got all of their feelings and thoughts kind of crammed into her body. And so my feeling was, at the end, it's just too much. Like, her body just can't endure that anymore. and her body just kind of wears out. But she knows, she knows that that's happening, and she wants to die on her own terms, and so she chooses this place that she wants to go back to, which is near where she grew up, and to kind of meet her death there. I think there was also, did you still have a question here in the front row?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
I'll come up there next.
later, yeah.
So in the end of the world by night, what happened to Sadie?
So I did intend it to be a little bit ambiguous. When I first wrote that story, and I revise stories a lot, so I'll write them 6 or 7 or 8 times. And the first ending I had, she just went back to she did go back to the cave, but it was pretty clear that she didn't have what she needed to survive, and she was gonna die there. And everyone I showed it to said, this is so depressing. This is so depressing and so harsh, and it just kind of takes away some of the beauty of the rest of the story. And I thought about it, and I felt like that was true. So I wanted to have it be an ending where you could where it's a little bit open to your interpretation as a reader, whether this is what really happens to her, that she really goes down there and finds some people who are waiting for her that she had heard earlier on, or whether it's a dream or something she's just imagining. And, she could wake up the next morning and decide she's going to do something completely different with her life. But she's just having this momentary dream where she feels loved and accepted.
All right, who up here was that?
Why did BK and her husband get a divorce?
So my thought about that was, she didn't choose to marry him, right? And she's just come to this point where she just doesn't want to be around him anymore. For a long time, she wanted to be around him just so that she could punish him for the horrible things he had done to her. And by the time she gets to the end of the story, she just wants to be able to let go of all of that and move on to kind of a new part of her life. But she doesn't really know what the rest of her life is going to look like. So I think it's scary for her too. In a way, it's a little more, it's so certain to know, okay, this is what I'm going to do every day. I'm going to make this man's life miserable because he did awful things. And in letting go of that, she then has to figure out, well, what is the purpose for the rest of her own life? So I think it's difficult for her, but she wants to make that really definitive step that she's not going to be attached to him anymore.
Is there a particular story that you connect to more than the others?
I think there are little parts of a lot of these stories that are either directly from my own life, or there are certain characters that I really relate to. So I was talking with Ms. Keeler about that first story with the caves is based on a trip that the two of us actually did together, where we went to Mammoth Cave Park in Kentucky, which is this huge system of caves that goes on for miles and miles. And you can we did this thing where you go with a guide and you can crawl through these caves for 4 hours. But they would tell us, even today with all the technology that we have, people have still gotten lost down there. And there's no GPS, your phone doesn't work down there. If you get lost, that may be it for you. So some of it's little things like that, things that I experienced that were really meaningful to me, and somehow ended up in a story. And then if you look at a story like Logging Lake, which was also another trip that I took, I went to that park, but also I think that main character, Robert, is he's struggling with this thing of he wants to be a more adventurous, exciting person, but he can't quite get himself to do it. And I think that's an idea that I relate to. I like to do adventurous things, but also sometimes I get the opportunity to do adventurous things and it just terrifies me. So I think there's just little bits and pieces of me in a lot of these different stories. And I think that's probably true for most writers, even when you think it isn't. Because a lot of times as a writer, you write a story and you think you're writing about people who are completely different from you, and you might even think that when you finish the story, and then you read it a year later or 2 years later, and you say, oh, this story was actually about that guy I was breaking up with when I wrote it. I just didn't realize it at the time. You know, it kind of sneaks in there whether you want it to or not.
What is Pleiades?
Literally, what does the word mean? Yeah, it's a constellation. So this is interesting, and I didn't know this actually until after I wrote the story. It's a constellation of 7 stars, and they actually say you can almost use it as an eye test because some of the stars are really hard to see. Unless you have really good vision, you can't see them. But there also used to be more stars in that constellation, and some of them, you know, like the ancient Greeks are the first people who identified it. At that time, there were more stars, and some of them have burned out since then. So once I learned that, I really liked the way it connected to the story, even though I didn't know it when I wrote the story.
What happened to Terry and logging?
I don't know. I really don't. So I do a lot of hiking, backcountry hiking, which is where there's no official campground. You're just kind of off in the wilderness. And usually you will tell someone what general direction you're going and when you plan to be back. But again, in national parks, it's actually not that uncommon that people get lost and just disappear and are not found again, or they're found, you know, their body is found 20 years later or something. And so I didn't have a specific, again, like I was sort of leaving it open for myself, like she could have just tripped and broken her neck and died, or she could have run off and be living with the wolves, or like she could have hitchhiked out of the park and started a new life somewhere else. And I really, in my mind, didn't have a specific answer to it, but I more like to think about kind of that sense of possibility. I think was what made her interesting to me, is that she was someone who was willing to just walk away from everything she knew and go try something completely different, even if that possibility was dangerous in some ways.
For Robert Greenman and the mermaid, was the mermaid ever real?
Oh yeah, she's definitely real. That's an interesting question. So I guess you could see it as his imagination, but as I intended it, she's definitely is real. Because I think a lot of what I'm thinking about in that story is, so you know, you read a lot of, I love to read fantasy books, and in a lot of fantasy books, like you'll have someone and they meet a fairy or a dragon or whatever, and they just carry on like that's a normal thing to happen, right? They're just like, oh yeah, cool, now I have this dragon. But I wanted to think about in real life, and especially if you were an adult, what would that do to you if you suddenly had this encounter with a magical creature that you were just absolutely convinced could not possibly exist, and yet there it was in front of you? You know, how would that affect you psychologically?
For the world by night, why is it so depressing at the end?
Why is it so depressing at the end? And sad. Well, okay, that main character, it's the 1800s. She has albinism, right? Like she's got the white skin and no pigment. People like that were really heavily discriminated against back then. I mean, the guy at the very beginning of the story talks about, I saw a girl like you in a freak show. I mean, that was a real thing, that people who looked that way would be like in a carnival driving around in a cart, and people would pay to just come and stare at them. So it would be a really hard time to have, to be different like that. There just wasn't a lot of acceptance of it, and I think the things that happened to her in that story just reflect the time that she was from, that there weren't a lot of happy options for people like that in those days.
Which story is your favorite?
Oh man, it has kind of changed over the years because I did write these over a long period of time. So I think Pleiades was my favorite for quite a while. And at this point, I actually think Killer of Kings is probably my favorite, just because I really like, when I read, I really like stories that have just a lot of beautiful imagery in them, and I think that one has the most imagery that I liked. And so, but if you ask me again in a year, it might be something different again.
Are the masters and mayonnaise, do they mean something today?
Do they, I mean, I really just intend them to represent, you know, I think all of us have in our lives, like there's somebody who's abusing power, right? Like they're in charge, but it's not enough for them to be in charge. They want to show they're in charge in the most hurtful way possible. And that is not an imaginary thing. Even though they look like these big Play-Doh balls, and that part's obviously imaginary, you know, there are plenty of examples from history and from current events of people in, you know, like in political positions or in other positions of power who just abuse their power and just use it as a way to suppress people as much as they can. So that's really what I was thinking of when I created them.
Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about how, you said you wrote the book over 12 years.
Yeah.
How do you even continue for 12 years, not even thinking that you're going to have a book at the end of it? What's that process like for you?
It's not, that is the not fun part of the process. I mean, I guess I just keep doing it because it's something that I think is important. And it's not like I had no success or recognition in those 12 years. I mean, I published some of these stories and a couple of them were republished or they won awards or they got nice reviews or something like that. So it's not like I had no positive feedback, which I think would have been really, really difficult. But I always had it in my head that someday this will be finished and I'll get to publish it, and I just had to sort of hold on to that idea. But also, I could have probably finished it faster if I had had a bit better, if I had managed my time a bit better. I'm going to be honest, it's really hard as an artist to, I mean, being an artist is a lot of, like, your friends are like, hey, we're going to the movies, you want to go? And you have to be like, no, I'm going to sit at home and write. Because if I go to the movies, that'll take up the rest of my night, and then tomorrow I have to go to work and I won't get any writing done. And sometimes you just give up and you're like, yeah, let's go to the movies. But it does take, in that way, I think, a lot of dedication. And so, it was just a process of being like, this is going to happen slowly, but I'm just going to keep doing it until it gets to where I want it to be.
Any other questions? Anyone want to ask another question? I think I'll ask one more, and then we have a writing exercise we're going to do as well. So my question deals with the fact that Miss Clair had all of her students write their own ending to your stories.
Yeah.
So many of your stories don't have an ending. Everything's not neat and tidy.
Yeah.
In your mind, is there a neat and tidy ending? And why do you decide to not give us those answers to some of these questions?
Yeah, there's usually in my mind is not a neat and tidy ending, and I think that's just maybe partly my view of life. Like, life just keeps moving, and it doesn't actually, until you're dead, there's not really a point where things end, right? Like, each event in your life is just the kicking off point for the next thing that happens in your life. And so I think one of the difficulties in a short story is you're looking at this really little slice out of somebody's life, and how do you even decide what's the beginning point and what's the end point? Where do you want to start telling the story and where do you want to stop? And so the point where I choose to stop is usually a point where the character has gone through some specific change or they've dealt with some specific problem, but that doesn't mean there's not a new problem on the horizon, and I usually kind of leave them right after they've finished dealing with one thing, but there's something new coming into the future. And it is hard, if you write a story where just everything turns out perfect at the end, it doesn't tend to feel real. It feels like a fairy tale. And even though I love fairy tales, that's not usually the effect I'm trying to give at the end of the story, and I think that's why a lot of them are kind of open to possibility.
Okay, we ready to do some writing? Yeah, love it. All right, let's do it.
So just to give you a little background on this writing assignment, I used to live in Iowa, and I would drive back and forth between Pittsburgh and Iowa a lot. And at the truck stops on Interstate 80, they would have this magazine called Country Singles, which was all singles ads, like people looking for love. But they were all people who either were long-distance truckers or they lived in really small towns and they hardly knew anybody, and so they were really having trouble finding someone to date. This was back, I guess, pre-internet dating, or at least before internet dating was big. Or they were in prison and they were trying to find someone, you know, who would be interested in having a relationship with them, either by mail or when they got out. So I would read this newspaper and I thought a lot of the ads were really funny to me. And my friends and I used to read them and laugh at them. But then after a while I would read them and I would start thinking, like, these are really just people who want someone to love them. And I think one of the biggest challenges when you're writing fiction is sometimes you have these characters who are really unusual in some way, but you have to make the reader love them, because the reader's not going to get invested in your story if they don't care about the people in the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass these around. I want everyone to take one. All of them are a personal ad from somebody, from Country Singles. So take your ad, I want you to read it, and then I want you to write a little scene in the life of this person who wrote the ad. And I want you to try to write it in a way that shows me just what their daily life is like, but that also makes me care about them and be interested in them and kind of want to know more about them.